The opening section of this week's Torah portion, Behar Bechukotai, which closes out the book of Leviticus, continues a series of sevens that began in last week's Torah portion. Last week, we began with the Exodus, and then through a series of sevens, learned of all the sacred and special days, moments, and festivals that were to be observed. It began with the Exodus, and of course the first seven that comes is 7 days. 7 days after the first day of the week is Shabbat. But the first festival, which was the commemoration of the Exodus, Passover, was followed by a week of weeks, 7 Shabbats, which leads into Shavuot, the period of the Omer in which we find ourselves currently. After that, counting again from the first experience of the peoplehood, the creation of community through the Exodus experience, was 7 months. So first it was 7 days, then 7 weeks, and now 7 months. And of course, in the 7th month was the sounding of the horns, the festival of the booths, and of course on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement, which will become operative also in the next series of sevens that picks up in this week's Torah portion. So we had 7 days, and then a week of weeks, 7 weeks, and then 7 months. After that, it was no longer community or people, but rather the land and the earth that were given that opportunity to observe cycles of 7. The first cycle of 7 that comes in this week's Torah portion is the 7 years, the sabbatical year. The Torah gives what seems to be an extensive set of rules to follow for the land in the sabbatical year. In actual fact, both this and the 7 years that will follow, the 7 years of years that will follow, the rabbis discovered, and in the Mishnah and the Talmud, expand upon the discussion which is far beyond the scope of this devar for this Shabbat. But it seems to be at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Behar, that these are the rules that the land will observe and the people will observe with the land. Again, remembering this is according to the Torah given by Moses at Sinai, so they are simply now 7 weeks after the original experience. And yet, there is a presumption of what will become in the future for the people and the community and the land of Israel. The questions of whether this is a knowledge of the future that God is giving to Moses, or whether that this is a retrogression by the later peoples in the experience, putting the experience back into Sinai, again, is of a great amount of discussion and beyond the scope of what this particular devar will cover. Suffice it to say that the Torah makes it very clear that the land gets a break every 7 years. The land gets to rest. There is no sowing or reaping. There is no working of the land. And of course, the natural question that arises is, so what do we eat? And in fact, that is in the Torah portion, what do we eat? The Torah then says, and God says through this Torah portion, Moses says on behalf of God, this is what you will eat for 3 years during that cycle. You will plant in the 6th year and harvest and do all of your normal work of the land in the 6th year, and the land will produce enough for 3 years. The question, of course, might arise, why 3? Why not 2? It just has to cover the 6th year and then the fallow sabbatical year. The answer is that in the 6th year, you reap, you sow, you harvest, you eat, you do all those things that are normal with the land in the 7th year, in the 6th year rather, but in the 7th year, you can't do any of those, so the land will produce enough for the 6th year and the 7th year. In some senses, this harkens back to the experience of the manna, when it was the miraculous manna that when it was gathered each and every day of the week was exactly the right amount for that day. In fact, if people gathered too much or decided that they wouldn't eat as much as they had gathered and left it aside for the next day, when they woke up the next day, it was maggots and mold and rotten and totally inedible. However, on Friday, on the sixth day, when they gathered, no matter how much they ate, there would be the same amount left over after they finished eating, and when they woke up on Shabbat morning, there would be exactly the right amount of food for that day as well. This was the great miracle of the manna, that it knew when was Shabbat and when was not Shabbat. In the same way, the land would know when it was the sixth year and when it was a regular year. For in the regular years, there would be enough produce for that year, but in the sixth year, there would be enough produce for the seventh year, the sabbatical year, as well. However, since you could not work the land at all, you could not plant, you could not do anything with the land in the seventh year, you had to wait until the eighth year to actually work the land again, which meant it would not produce food until the beginning of the ninth year. And so the land in the sixth year produced enough food for the sixth year, for the seventh year, the sabbatical year, and for the eighth year when the land was being worked, and then finally in the ninth year, things would return. In the second portion of this week, Bechukotai, we are reminded that this only works if we really do everything else that God commands of us. This is an ideal setup of the sixth year, the seventh year, the eighth year, the ninth year, and then all over again in the next cycle. That question of when it breaks down is, of course, worth discussing in other places and in other times. In this Devar, I simply want to present some opportunities to think about what might be the opportunities to discuss and what might be the lessons that we can still carry forward today. There are indeed those who try to follow strictly what the land is supposed to do, and this, of course, is valid. But beyond that, since most of us are not farmers, most of us do not work the land, even those with gardens or who do some land work certainly are not producing enough food for themselves for the sixth year of every sabbatical season, let alone the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth year without working the land. So there's a spiritual issue as well to the sabbatical year, the idea that in the smaller portions of our time, in the days, the weeks, the months, the year cycle, which was last week's Torah portion, taking a break, taking time, taking a sabbatical of weeks, days, months, is always worth thinking about and worth processing. But even in the larger picture, over the courses of the years, whether one takes a sabbatical year, as some academic and other positions do, or whether one simply says, even in the longer period, even in the larger period, even when I have been taking a break in my week with Shabbat, or during the annual cycles with the holidays, in the larger picture, it's worth taking stock on some kind of regular basis, perhaps every 6-7 years, as it were, to say, where am I now, where have I been, and where am I going? So this becomes part of the sabbatical process, the 7-year cycle that Behar begins with. But Behar then moves on to an even more difficult and more puzzling process, which is a week of years, that is 7 sets of sabbatical years, 49 years. The 49th year, of course, is a regular sabbatical year, and everything has to follow the regular sabbatical. However, the 50th year is an additional year, the Yovel, the Jubilee year, which becomes not only for the land, not only for agriculture, but also for the walled cities, also for the society in general. And the sabbatical, then the Jubilee, contains an additional level of what one does in justice in society. The reason this is more puzzling and more difficult is it sets up an ideal which one can wonder whether it really ever happened and whether it really was intended to ever happen, or whether it was simply a set of rules and guidances and systems, ethics, and deeper values that lead towards some kind of future idyllic world, the messianic world or the utopian world, whatever one might like to call it. In this particular portion of the Jubilee year, on the 50th year, the Torah specifically says this is a time to proclaim liberty, to proclaim emancipation, to proclaim some sense of change. And in fact, that translation, to proclaim liberty throughout the land, is on the Liberty Bell, as most people do know. It's taken from this week's Torah portion, although not actually by the Founding Fathers, in the context in which we might understand this week's Torah portion to mean it. The 50th year, the Jubilee year, the year of liberty proclaimed, and here we are back on our 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonements, with a sounding of the horns, everyone who has sold his land or her land, as Slavchad's daughters might have, everyone who has given up their inheritance returns to the inheritance. This, of course, was designed specifically for Israel in the times of the biblical period after the conquest and the settlement, after each tribe had been given their land. This is the time in which every tribe was given a portion of the land, and every family was given a portion of the tribal land. And that thus becomes the complaint and the solution for Slavchad's daughters in a different Torah portion, when they say, "Our father did nothing wrong. Why should we lose the family name and the family inheritance?" And then the solutions will also come in that Torah portion. But the issue of everyone gets their own land, everyone gets their own homestead. And over the course of 49 years, some might do well and some might not do so well. Some might find that they can buy the land of their neighbors who are not doing so well and need some support. Some might find that they have to sell some of the, or all of their land to their neighbors or to someone so that they can survive a few more years. At the end of the 50th year, however, everyone goes back to the original inheritance. The reason why this is problematic and difficult really to follow is over the course of those 49 years, family size will have changed within the family name. And so, in theory, every family was given the right amount of land for that number of people at the time that the tribe settled into the land. However, over time, some families would need more land, some families would need less land, and at the end of 50 years, a family of 50 might return to a land that was designed for 5, and a family of 1 might return to a land that was originally designed for 15. So inequities are going to come in, even though it sounds like this is the solution to any inequity that might arise among people. This is a challenge then that is far beyond the scope of this Devar, but rather is a challenge even for us today for the issue of equality versus fairness. The Torah portion creates what it seems to be an equal system of justice, not necessarily a fair system of justice. The challenge here is to try to decide which was really the ideal of the Torah portion. Is the Torah portion saying that everyone should be equal in all that they possess, which is what it says on the surface, or should it be that everyone is fairly treated in the ways in which they relate to what they need? The original land was given on the basis of need. At the end of 50 years, if it's returned equally without a sense of fairness or need, then there would still be an inequity between those who had the original land, which was more than they needed, and those who had the original land, which was less than was needed. So I leave this with a challenge. The Torah does not give a clear answer, but rather the Torah guides us to discuss, to dig deeper, and to strive to better understand how we can apply Torah to today. What is fair? What is equal? And what is equitable? Do we wait 50 years to address injustices that arise over that time, as the Jubilee year would seem to indicate? Or are we challenged to try to keep inequities, unfairness, and other issues of injustice from arising so that they do not have to wait to be resolved, but are resolved as they arise? A few thoughts, a little challenge for this week's Torah portion, Behar Bechukotai.